The disappearance of the 3 Blackwood sisters remains the most chilling vacancy in the archives of this county. A void into which the reason of men has frequently tumbled and been lost. Henry Taylor, a man whose sensibilities had been cauterized by years in the constabulary, and who was now tasked with the grim duty of condensing these 40 years of silence into a final summary, felt the weight of the task like a physical shroud pressing against his chest. It was on the morning of the 13th of November that he returned to the derelict manor on the edge of the salt marshes, where the sea fret clung to the gables like the fingers of a drowning man. The house was a hollow shell, its windows staring blindly out at the grey expanse of the North Sea, yet within its damp, stained walls a presence lingered that defied the natural order of dissolution. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of salt, ancient paper, and a faint, cloying sweetness that reminded him of lilies left too long in a funeral parlor. As Henry moved through the library, his boots echoing with a hollow rhythmic thud upon the warped floorboards, a movement in the shadows caught his eye. A small, soot-colored cat, remarkably lean and possessing eyes of a disconcerting pale sulfur, sat perched atop a stack of rotting ledgers. It did not flee at his approach, but watched him with a stillness that was utterly unnatural. Beneath its paws lay a singular, hand-drawn map, its ink faded to the color of dried blood. This was the first piece of evidence to surface in a generation, a document that whispered of a congregation far more sinister than a mere local superstition. The sisters had not wandered into the tide. They had been summoned by a power that resided in the very silt of the estuary. Henry reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he moved to retrieve the parchment, but the cat hissed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone, and struck out with a claw that glinted like polished obsidian. The notes in the margin of the map, written in a hand that trembled with a terrifying fervency, spoke of the oracle of the estuary, a figure, or perhaps a force that demanded a tithe of innocence to keep the waters from rising and swallowing the town whole. Henry felt a coldness seep into his marrow, a sensation that had nothing to do with the biting coastal wind. He realized then that the Blackwood case was not a tragedy of misadventure, but a meticulously choreographed ritual. The cat let out a low, guttural cry and vanished into the wainscoting, leaving Henry alone with the realization that the names in the ledger did not end with the sisters. There were dozens more, a lineage of the lost that stretched back centuries, each entry marked with a symbol that resembled a weeping eye. The sense of overwhelming malevolence in the room became so thick he could almost taste the copper of old blood on his tongue. He was no longer merely a recorder of facts. He was a witness to a living, breathing shadow that had never truly departed from the marsh. The summary he was meant to write would never be finished, for the case was not cold. It was merely waiting for the next name to be added to its tally. He looked at his own pale reflection in a cracked mirror, and saw the same shadow flickering behind his eyes, a darkness that was now his to carry into the night. The ledger was not merely a record of those who had vanished, but a terrifyingly precise itinerary of those yet to be taken. Henry Taylor felt a sudden, sharp prickling at the nape of his neck, a sensation of being scrutinized by unseen eyes from every corner of the decaying library. He turned the pages with a feverish desperation, his breath hitching, as he realized the dates were meticulously aligned with the lunar cycles, a pattern of celestial obedience that made his skin crawl. The names were written in a script that grew increasingly erratic as the years progressed, culminating in a hand that seemed to have been guided by a profound, trembling ecstasy. Among the entries for the upcoming solstice, he found a name that caused the blood to drain from his face, his own, inscribed with a flourish that suggested a dark inevitability. The soot-colored cat reappeared, its sulfurous gaze fixed upon him from the shadows of a collapsed bookshelf, letting out a low, vibrating purr that felt like a mockery of his rising panic. He fled the manor, the salt spray stinging his eyes as he navigated the treacherous path back toward the village of Morston-on-Sea. The mist had thickened, a white, suffocating blanket that muffled the sound of the crashing waves until the world felt reduced to the narrow circle of light cast by his failing torch. In the village archives, hidden beneath the damp foundations of the town hall, he unearthed a set of architectural plans that had been suppressed for a century. They depicted a subterranean network of tunnels, extending from the manor out beneath the estuary, converging at a central chamber labeled the Oracle's Throat. It was here, the document suggested, that the town's elders had once gathered to appease the ancient, hungry spirit of the silt. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The cult was not a relic of the past, but the very foundation upon which Morston had been built, a pact signed in the mud and kept secret through generations of complicit silence. The air in the archive grew impossibly cold. the smell of brine and decay intensifying until he felt he might gag. He heard the soft, rhythmic padding of paws on the stone floor behind him. The cat had followed him, or perhaps it had been waiting for him all along. It led him deeper into the damp recesses of the cellar, where a heavy iron door stood ajar, revealing a staircase that descended into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the light of his torch. At the foot of the stairs, he found a small, neatly folded pile of children's clothing, still damp with seawater and smelling faintly of lilies. Beside the clothes lay a silver locket he recognized from the Blackwood case files, a piece of evidence that should have been locked in a police vault miles away. The cycle was beginning again, and the Oracle was no longer satisfied with the shadows of the past. It demanded a presence in the present, and Henry was the invited guest to its terrible feast. He felt the weight of the dark water pressing down from above, a crushing certainty that there was no escape from the tide that was now rising within his own soul. The locket did not contain the expected memento of a grieving parent, but rather a coil of wet, translucent fiber that pulsed with a faint rhythmic vibration against Henry Taylor's palm. It was as if the object itself were drawing breath from the damp, salt-heavy air of the cellar. Henry's investigation took a more harrowing turn as he pulled a secondary, leather-bound volume from a hidden niche behind the iron door, a register of those who had served as the Tithe Collectors for the estuary. To his profound horror, the final entry was not a stranger's name, but that of Inspector Miller, the very man whose unexplained retirement had led to Henry's appointment. Miller had not left the force due to ill health. He had been subsumed by the office he was meant to dismantle. The realization was a cold blade between Henry's ribs. The soot-colored cat sat upon a nearby crate, its tail twitching with a predatory precision, watching as Henry discovered a set of keys labeled with the initials of the Blackwood Manor's last steward. The silence of the archive was suddenly fractured by a sound from beneath the floorboards, a low, rhythmic thrumming that mimicked the heartbeat of a massive, submerged beast. It was the sound of the Oracle's throat drawing in the first draft of the evening tide. Henry followed the vibration to a grate in the floor, where the scent of ancient, rotting vegetation rose to meet him, thick and cloying like the breath of a stagnant pond. Through the iron bars he glimpsed a flickering luminescence deep within the earth, a pale, sickly glow that suggested a gathering of light where none should exist. He realized then that the village was not merely silent out of fear, but active in its devotion. The very foundations of the town hall were built upon the altar of their terrible god. The cat moved toward the grate, its claws scraping against the metal with a sound like a needle on a jagged record, and with a sudden fluid motion, it slipped through the bars into the abyss below. Driven by a compulsion that felt less like courage and more like the pulling of a puppet strings, Henry forced the grate open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. As he descended the narrow, slime-slicked ladder into the tunnel, the water began to seep through the walls, not the clean salt water of the sea, but a black, viscous ichor that stained his hands and clothes with the mark of the marsh. The tunnel opened into a vaulted chamber, where the walls were encrusted with shells that seemed to have grown into the shape of screaming faces. There, standing upon a dais of salt-bleached bone, was the cat, its sulfurous eyes now the only source of light in the overwhelming gloom. Before it lay a fresh garment, a heavy robe woven from the same translucent fiber Henry had found in the locket. It was sized perfectly for him. The summary of the Blackwood case was no longer a matter of historical record. It had become a living script, and Henry Taylor was being fitted for his role in the final act. The water rose to his knees, cold as the grave, and from the darkness of the throat, a voice that was not a voice, a sound like the shifting of 1,000 tons of silt, whispered his name. The whisper did not emanate from a throat of flesh and blood, but from the very fissures of the weeping stone walls. It was a sound composed of the grinding of tectonic plates and the wet, rhythmic slap of the incoming tide against the estuary's muddy banks. Henry Taylor stood paralyzed, the icy brine swirling around his thighs, as the robe of translucent fibers began to drift toward him on the surface of the rising water, moving with a predatory intent of its own. The soot-colored cat, now perched upon a ledge of calcified remains, watched with a cold, judicial detachment that suggested it was less a pet and more a sentinel of the threshold. As the light from his torch flickered and died, replaced by the sickly bioluminescent pulse of the walls, Henry saw the names. They were carved into the rock in a vertical line. 13 in total, each one corresponding to a decade of the town's prosperity. His own name was not merely written. It was etched with a fresh, raw violence that suggested the stone itself had bled to accommodate the letters. The realization that he was the intended successor to a line of sacrificial stewards, the 13th link in a chain of human currency, shattered the last remnants of his professional composure. He reached out to steady himself, his fingers sinking into a layer of slick, grey moss that felt remarkably like the skin of a drowned man. Beneath this fungal growth, he felt the hard, unmistakable ridges of bone. The walls were not merely stone. They were a charnel house, a mosaic of those who had served the oracle before him. Each of the previous 12 collectors had been absorbed into the architecture of the throat, their calcium and marrow serving as the mortar for this subterranean temple. This was the dark significance of the number 13 mentioned in the suppressed ledgers, a tally that signaled the completion of a grand cycle of local desolation. The overwhelming scent of stagnant water and ancient, unwashed sin filled his lungs, making every breath a labor of agony as the water continued its relentless ascent toward his chest. Above him, through the iron grate he had so foolishly bypassed, came the sound of rhythmic chanting and the heavy synchronized tread of many feet. The village of Morston-on-Sea had awakened. They were not sleeping in their beds, but standing in a circle around the town hall, their voices rising in a dissonant harmony that mimicked the groaning of the tide. They were calling for the oracle to wake, and for the Tithe Collector to finally take his place. Henry scrambled back toward the ladder, but the rungs had dissolved into a gelatinous sludge under the influence of the rising ichor. The cat let out a sharp, commanding yowl, and the water suddenly surged, a wall of black, freezing liquid that knocked him from his feet. In the chaos of the deluge, he saw the faces of the villagers peering down through the grate, pallid, moon, like masks of anticipation. They were not there to rescue him. They were there to witness his inauguration. As the water filled his mouth, tasting of salt and old rusted iron, he felt the translucent robe wrap itself around his limbs like a second skin, pulling him down toward the lightless heart of the estuary. He was becoming the very thing he had been sent to investigate, a cold case that would never be closed because it would never truly end. The sensation of the translucent robe was not that of fabric, but of 1,000 cold, wet mouths pressing against his skin, suckling the warmth from his blood until he felt as hollow as a sea-bleached shell. Henry Taylor did not drown in the conventional sense. The black ichor that filled the vaulted chamber did not seek to extinguish his life, but to preserve it within a state of agonizing, suspended animation. As the water crested over his head, the roar of the estuary above faded into a profound, vibrating silence that resonated through his very bones. In this lightless pressure, his vision began to adapt, the bioluminescence of the walls revealing the true nature of his predecessors. They were not merely skeletons embedded in the rock. They were the rock itself, their faces distorted into calcified masks of eternal vigilance, their eyes replaced by the same sulfurous stones that gleamed in the sockets of the soot-colored cat. This was the true cold case of Morston-on-Sea, a lineage of men who had been processed into the landscape, serving as the sensory organs for a deity that possessed neither form nor mercy. He felt a cold, slippery thought belonging to Inspector Miller brush against his mind. It was not a voice, but a memory of salt and betrayal, a ledger of names that Miller had been forced to compile before his own dissolution. Henry understood then that his duty as the 13th collector was to finalize the inventory of the village's debt. The cat swam through the viscous medium with an impossible grace, its fur billowing like smoke in the water, until it pressed its cold muzzle against his forehead. The contact was an ice burn, a searing brand that ignited a sequence of terrifying images within his mind, visions of the estuary as it had been before the first stone of Morston was laid. He saw the black silt churning with a hunger that preceded humanity, a primeval mouth that had waited for the first footfall of a creature capable of worship. The cat's sulfurous eyes were no longer merely observers. They were the lenses through which the oracle perceived the world of air and light. Henry felt his own identity fragmenting, the memories of his life in the constabulary dissolving like sugar in the brine. He was being purged of the man to make room for the instrument. The translucent fibers of the robe tightened, stitching themselves into his very dermis, weaving a tapestry of misery that bound his nervous system to the rhythmic pulse of the tides. The walls of the chamber began to weep a different substance, not salt water but a thick, crimson fluid that clouded the black ichor. Henry realized with a jolt of visceral terror that the inventory he had been tasked to summarize was not a list of the dead, but a ledger of the living whose life force was currently being siphoned through the foundations of the town. Each name he had seen in the archive was a conduit, a vein tapped by the oracle to sustain its ancient subterranean slumber. He saw the Blackwood sisters, not as they were in the photographs, but as pale, translucent wraiths drifting through the silt, their voices reduced to the sound of bubbles breaking on the surface. They were the scribes of this aquatic purgatory, and he was to be their master. The summary was a living document, a tally of the village's heartbeat, and it required his signature, not in ink, but in the total surrender of his will to the darkness. The cat let out a sound that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in his skull, a command that compelled him to move. He found himself drifting toward a shaft that led upward, not back to the cellar, but toward the very center of the village square. He was the Tithe Collector now, a spectral figure draped in the membrane of the marsh, rising from the depths to claim the interest on a debt that could never be repaid. As he breached the surface of the village well, the air felt thin and abrasive against his newly sensitized skin. The villagers stood in the moonlight, their faces upturned and expectant, their eyes reflecting the same sickly sulfurous light as the cat's. They were not victims. They were the flock, and he was the shepherd sent to cull them for the sake of the estuary's continued silence. The first villager stepped forward, a woman whose face he recognized from the local bakery, and knelt before him, offering her wrist with a terrifying, ecstatic submission. He felt the fibers of his sleeve reach out, thin as spider silk and sharp as razors, to draw the first measure of the night's offering. The cat sat atop the well-stone lip, its tail twitching in rhythmic approval of the harvest. He looked down at his hands and saw they were no longer flesh, but a translucent, pearlescent substance that allowed him to see the dark, churning water flowing where his blood had once been. The transformation was complete. He reached for the next villager, his mind a void filled only with the hunger of the oracle and the cold, unyielding logic of the ledger. The case was no longer cold. It was a white-hot agony of realization. He was the bridge between the mud and the moon, the 13th and final architect of the village's damnation. The village square of Morston-on-Sea had become a crucible of silent, rhythmic suffering. Henry Taylor, or the entity that now inhabited his skin, stood at the center of a circle of pallid faces, his limbs draped in the shifting, translucent membrane that pulsed with the stolen vitality of the marsh. The baker's wife remained kneeling, her head bowed in a posture of terrifying, religious devotion, as the fibers of Henry's sleeve, now less like cloth and more like the grasping cilia of some deep sea parasite, burrowed into the soft flesh of her arm. There was no scream, only a soft, wet sound like the tearing of damp parchment as her life, force, a pale and shimmering essence, was drawn upward through the well-s stone throat. Henry felt the influx of her memories, her mundane fears, and her absolute curdled love for the thing that dwelt beneath the silt. It was an overwhelming communion, a sensory assault that tasted of copper and cold, stagnant brine. The soot-colored cat sat upon the well, asleep, its sulfurous eyes reflecting the flickering bioluminescence that now emanated from Henry's own chest. By the time the moon had reached its zenith, the square was littered with the husks of the villagers, their bodies not dead, but drained of the animating spark that defined them as human. They stood or sat in a state of catatonic grace, their eyes vacant and milky. It was then that the plot of the estuary's long game achieved its next, more devastating phase. Henry felt a shift in the very gravity of the earth beneath his feet. The 13th Collector was not merely a harvester. He was a living anchor, a conduit designed to bridge the gap between the subterranean depths and the world of breath. The translucent robe began to expand, its fibers reaching out from his body to lace into the cobblestones, the walls of the bakery, and the timbered frames of the surrounding cottages. He was literally stitching the village into the maw of the oracle. The cat let out a sharp, percussive yowl that echoed with the sound of a heavy door slamming shut in an empty house. The ground began to groan, a deep tectonic protest as the sea fret thickened into a physical weight. The final realization of his role as the author of this cold case summary came with a surge of agonizing clarity. The summary was not a document to be filed away, but the final accounting that balanced the books of the estuary. To complete the 13th entry, the entire history of Morston-on-Sea had to be erased, consumed by the same mud that had birthed its secret pact. Henry watched, his vision now a kaleidoscope of sulfur and shadow, as the first house at the edge of the square began to sink. It did not collapse. It was simply drawn downward, the stone and wood dissolving into the rising black ichor that now flooded the streets. The taste of salt was everywhere thick and cloying as the North Sea began to claim its interest. He was no longer a man named Taylor. He was the final signature on a deed of total reclamation. The cat leaped from the well and vanished into the swirling mist, leaving Henry to stand as the solitary glowing monument to a town that was being unmade. The weight of the water was no longer outside him. It was the very substance of his being, a cold, crushing finality that promised a silence deeper than any archive could ever hold. The dissolution of Morston-on-Sea was not a violent upheaval, but a slow, rhythmic subsidence, a sinking into the maw of the estuary that felt as inevitable as the turning of the tide. Henry Taylor, now a shimmering, translucent pillar of grief, watched as the village church, with its spire of weathered flint, surrendered to the black ichor. The bells gave a single, muffled toll as they were submerged, a sound like a heavy stone dropped into a deep, stagnant well. He felt the village, his history, every birth, every burial, every whispered sin being processed through his own borrowed nervous system. The cat, that soot-colored harbinger of the threshold, reappeared amidst the rising muck, its paws silent upon the surface of the black liquid. It did not swim, it walked upon the film of the deluge, leading him toward the skeletal remains of the town hall. The overwhelming weight of the 13 names he had seen in the ledger now pressed upon his mind with a physical force, each identity a cold, sharp needle stitching itself into his consciousness. As he reached the ruins of the archive, the water parted to reveal a horrific sight. The floor had not merely collapsed, it had become a living mouth of silt and calcified bone. There, half embedded in the wall of the oracle's throat, was the figure of Inspector Miller. He was not a corpse, but a gargoyle of salt and grey moss, his eyes replaced by the same pale sulphur stones that Henry felt growing within his own sockets. Miller's mouth opened, and instead of words, a stream of thick, brackish water spilled out, carrying with it the taste of rusted iron and ancient, unwashed secrets. Henry realized that the summary he had been tasked to write was not a document for the living, but a final confession for the oracle. He was the 13th, the one who must close the book by adding the final, crushing weight of his own family's history to the tally. The cat hissed, a sound like the tearing of wet silk, and pointed with a single obsidian claw toward a record that had been buried beneath Miller's feet. It was a birth certificate, dated 40 years prior, bearing the name of a child born in the manor on the night the Blackwood sisters vanished. The name on the parchment was his own. Henry Taylor had not been sent to Morston-on-Sea by chance. He had been called home. He was the secret son of the marsh, the final tithe that had been missing from the ledger. The realization was a cold, sharp blade that severed the last of his human tether. The cat leaped onto his shoulder, its weight as heavy as a leaden shroud, and whispered a name into his ear. A name that was not Henry, but a guttural vibration that resonated with the deep, churning hunger of the silt. He felt his legs dissolve into the rising blackness, his torso becoming one with the foundations of the town. The cold case was finally resolved. He was both the investigator and the evidence, the hunter and the prey, the 13th sacrifice that would finally satiate the oracle's millennial hunger. The village was gone, replaced by a vast, shimmering expanse of black water under a moon that bled no light. He closed his sulfurous eyes and prepared to begin the long, silent vigil of the centuries. The sea does not merely reclaim its own. It digests the memory of the land until the very concept of home becomes a bitter, salt-crusted lie. Henry Taylor, or what remained of the man who had once carried that name, felt the finality of his transformation as the last vestiges of the village of Morston-on-Sea were pulled beneath the churning, black surface of the estuary. The cold case summary he had been tasked to complete was no longer a matter of ink and paper. It was being etched into the very marrow of his soul, a record of every scream silenced by the silt and every life, spark snuffed out by the rising tide. The soot-colored cat sat upon his shoulder, its weight as heavy as a leaden shroud, its sulfurous eyes reflecting a world that was no longer composed of light and shadow, but of a singular, monochromatic dread. He could feel the weight of the 13 names, the 13 links in the chain of local damnation, vibrating through his calcified ribs like the low, rhythmic thrumming of a great submerged engine. This was the true inventory of the marsh, a tally of human currency paid to a god that possessed neither face nor mercy, only an insatiable, ancient hunger. The realization struck him then, with the force of a freezing gale, that the oracle was not a localized spirit of the mud, but a vast, terrestrial malignancy that used the coastal fringes as its primary digestive tract. His vision now filtered through the iridescent sheen of a dead fish's eye expanded beyond the sunken village. He saw the network of tunnels, the throat, not merely extending beneath the estuary, but threading like necrotic veins through the very crust of the earth, connecting to other forgotten towns, other desolate shores, and other men like himself who had been processed into the landscape. The summary he was writing was not an end, but a terrifyingly precise blueprint for a global reclamation. The cat let out a low, vibrating purr that resonated with the sound of grinding tectonic plates, and Henry felt a sudden, sharp tug at the core of his being as the oracle began to draw upon the collective memories he had harvested from the villagers. He was being used as a lens, a focal point through which the entity could project its influence into the minds of the living in distant cities. The cold case of the Blackwood sisters was merely the first chapter in a much larger narrative of extinction. Henry, his internal monologue, once the rational voice of a constabulary officer, was now a cacophony of 1,000 drowning voices, all clamoring for a finality that he alone could provide. The texture of his skin had become like wet, flaking slate, and his breath smelled of old rusted iron and the cloying sweetness of lilies left to rot in a stagnant pond. He felt the cat claws dig into his translucent flesh, a grounding pain that reminded him of his duty. He was to be the architect of the next phase, the one who would broadcast the oracle as summons across the frequencies of human consciousness. The overwhelming sense of malevolence that had once terrified him was now his only comfort, a cold, dark embrace that promised an end to the agony of individuality. He began to dictate the final entries of the summary, not in English, but in the wet, rhythmic language of the tide, preparing the way for the 14th and the 15th and the endless line of those who would follow him into the black, waiting silt. The summary was no longer a report, it was a prayer for the coming night. The final entry in the Blackwood archive is not written in ink, but in a substance that mimics the cold, dark consistency of the estuary deepest mud. Henry Taylor, the man who was once a servant of the law and a recorder of mundane tragedies, has ceased to exist as a creature of breath and bone, becoming instead the living ink of a record that spans the centuries. The number 13 stands at the head of this final page, a numerical seal that completes the cycle of the tithe and signals the total reclamation of Morston-on-Sea by the ancient, hungry silt. The soot-colored cat, the silent witness to this long dissolution, sits upon the now submerged lid of the village well, its sulfurous eyes the only beacons in a world that has been surrendered to the rising black ichor. This summary is the last testament of a town that was never meant to survive its own secret history, a document that serves as a bridge between the world of the living and the lightless maw of the oracle. As the tide reaches its absolute zenith, the physical remains of the village archives are not destroyed, but transmuted into a calcified reef of memory beneath the waves. Henry feels the weight of the ledger merging with his own translucent spine, each name of the lost sisters, and the drained villagers becoming a sharp crystalline deposit in his marrow. The plot of this long, dormant case has reached its ultimate conclusion. The investigator has been processed into the evidence, and the summary has become a summons. The oracle does not merely sleep. It breathes through the lungs of the 13th collector, its influence radiating outward from the estuary like a slow, rhythmic pulse of decay. The coldness that once seeped into Henry, his marrow is now the very essence of his being, a frigid, unyielding certainty that the hunt is over because the prey has finally been digested. The overwhelming sensation of the dark water pressing against his mind is no longer a source of terror, but the comforting embrace of a destiny that was written in the mud long before his birth. The report, now complete, is broadcast not through wires or paper, but through the psychic residue left in the wake of the town's disappearance. In the distant, dusty offices of the county constabulary, a clerk will find a folder that was previously empty, now filled with a damp, salt-smelling parchment that bears Henry Taylor's signature in a hand that seems to shiver with the movement of the sea. The case is marked as closed, yet the very act of reading the summary will plant the seeds of the oracle's hunger in the mind of the next man tasked with its filing. The cat lets out a final percussive cry that shatters the stillness of the moonlit marsh before vanishing into the swirling sea fret. The cold case of Morston-on-Sea is resolved, not with justice, but with a total and terrifying equilibrium. Henry Taylor is the silence between the waves, the shadow beneath the silt, and the final enduring word in a story that has no end. The estuary remains, a vast and shimmering expanse of black glass, waiting for the next name to be etched into the ledger of the deep.